Wonderful. Well, as people know, because we do these things sporadically and not always on the same day or at the same time, so I'm sure everybody's well tuned in to this series. We've been talking with people at Springtide who are like paying attention to this generation, 13 to 25-year-olds, in their own unique lane. So at Springtide, of course, we're taking this big view about sort of what religion means to them, both institutionally, but also outside of the institutions. We're thinking about how meaning matters to them, both in a religious and a non-religious sense, really at that intersection between their faith lives and their daily lives. And I've had the opportunity now to get to chat with a bunch of people who are much more focused than on a particular area than we are. And y'all are joining us from Orange. And so I'd love, Crystal, you're executive director. Brett, you're a coach? No, student specialist. What's the title?
Yeah, Orange specialist. Yeah,
Orange specialist. That's what it is. I was like, if I say all the words, maybe they'll form into a job title. Before we get moving, can you all sort of introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what you do at Orange, so that way everybody sort of gets the lay of the land here?
For sure. My name is Crystal. I work with both our middle school and high school content teams here at Orange. So every week we create resources for churches and for parents, and particularly for anyone who works with the middle school or high school age group. And we care a whole lot about making those resources timely and also making them developmentally appropriate. So I get to work with lots of artists and theologians and educators and pastors and different groups of people to make sure that those resources are great.
Yeah, my name is Brett, and my role is as an Orange student specialist. And so we have some Orange specialists on staff, and our main role is really partnering with church leaders that are connecting with and reaching and trying to influence students all over the world, really. And a big part of what we do is kind of coach them and help them understand Orange strategy, implement Orange resources, but also just have broader conversations about how do we lead well? How do we build good systems in ministry? How do we partner with parents? So on a bigger strategy scale too.
Yeah, that's great. And this is exactly why, we were so excited to get to talk with y'all, is because we've been hearing a lot from campus ministers, from parachurch ministries, and one of the things that one of the things that all these groups have in common is this real sense for this real close connection for what life is like on the ground, working in a professional ministry capacity. We've been talking with people across different faith traditions, in this case from very much rooted in Protestant Christian world. But just to get us started here, maybe walk us through, like, what are some of the biggest challenges that you all are seeing that that professional ministry faces today when it comes to trying to connect with and engage with young people, Gen Z?
One of the challenges that keeps coming up in nearly every conversation is that we all see something is changing and no one is really sure exactly what it is. That there is something different with this generation, and especially this generation post-pandemic, and what does that mean for us? I noticed a great illustration of that just this week in a youth pastor Facebook group. There was this conversation about how it used to be easy to talk to students on social media. You just pick the biggest one and you talk to them because they're all there on that platform. It was MySpace, then it was Facebook, it was Twitter, it was Instagram, but they were all in one spot, and they're not anymore. They're in a lot of places. And that's such a reflection of what's happened with student culture, that it was sort of this monoculture in the early 2000s, and it has splintered into these subgroups or these mini kingdoms with influencers within each kingdom. And that's why we think it's a really big deal that youth ministries are unique, that people trying to reach young people are not going for this same method in every location, because each one of these subgroups sort of needs a leader. And I know for a long time we've talked about, in education and in ministry and even in sports, there's this sort of one size fits all mentality, and student culture is changing from a one size fits all, sort of a one big lane highway, to a multi-lane highway. And for us, successful, at least in what we do, our churches have to begin to think in a multi-lane highway mindset as well.
Well, I want to be a part of the social network where Crystal is an influencer. If they each have their own, what platform is that?
It's her Chihuahua that's the social media influencer.
That's really true. My Instagram feed is almost entirely an elderly Chihuahua.
Well, I'm curious then, the natural follow-up question for me there is about, what you described, I could see it going either way. Like, do you get the sense then that like local context, physical place is more important than ever or less important than ever as the world becomes like sort of more fractured?
I'm entirely guessing, but my best guess is that it's both and, depending on the context. That there's not a one size fits all answer, even for whether we should be physically meeting or digitally meeting, but it depends on the context and the personality of the kid. We've seen some groups thrive with digital ministry. My own small group grew when we began to meet digitally because some students were able to attend that weren't able to attend before. And then on the flip side, in a lot of contexts, that we know that isn't working. It's not working in education, and it's really creating a struggle for connection in a lot of contexts. So I think more than ever, we have to be specialized to the group that we're serving, and not necessarily to a particular method.
Yeah.
Brett, what is that? You're nodding along, but is that what you're seeing too?
Yeah, it's so hard to, it's, ministry for a while, especially since the pandemic, is so difficult to wrap up as like nationally, like, oh, this is what works, this is what doesn't work. We would have, part of what we do in our role is we get to have conversations with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of student pastors from all over. And a student pastor in Oregon might say, well, what's working where you are? And we're down in the Southeast, the church that I'm involved in, that I volunteer. So what's working for us could be very different than what's working for them up there. And really the only overlap pieces that we see on a regular basis is whatever the vehicles might be, whatever, if it's, in person, if it's digital, it's the relational connection side of how are we pointing people towards each other in community, and how are we helping raise up leaders that are investing relationally, where they view themselves more of pastor and shepherd of certain students, rather than someone who is there to help make a program happen. Because what we saw over the pandemic, programs weren't possible for a lot of people for a really long time. And we saw a lot of student ministries say, my leaders are ghosting me. And that was probably because those leaders felt like it was their responsibility to help make a program happen. No program, no need for me. And then we also had leaders that took it to a next gear, because they recognize, hey, my role is not necessarily to make a program happen. It's to lead this group of people I've been entrusted with, to shepherd them, to pastor them. So like Crystal's saying, it's kind of all over the place with what some of the methods are, but some of these strategies are the pieces that kind of are the, that tie everywhere, no matter where it is.
Now, where would they get the idea that their job is not to do programs? I mean, that's all of their training. That's like everything that we all grew up in. If we grew up in if you grew up in this environment like I did, and like I imagine some of our viewers did, like you grew up in a program environment, and I imagine most of the people doing youth ministry grew up in this very program. We've been writing and researching about this a lot, about the need for relationships, and we didn't come into it with a particular agenda in that regard, as much as our agenda is just to follow the data. And then we ask these questions, and then the data stated pretty clearly that what young people want from adults are relationships of a particular kind. We don't need to go through all that, but I'm curious, like, how do you, as y'all are thinking about resourcing and coaching people, how do you get them to make that? I would imagine, like, first it's a mindset shift, right? And then but there's also like a real skills gap there too. So I'm curious if y'all could talk a little bit about, like, how do you get that first step of understanding that we're probably going to have to make a move here if we really believe and are listening, in what young people are telling us.
Yeah, and sadly, I think that one of the biggest challenges comes from leadership at churches, is that a lot of church leadership is still expecting the same kind of measurement and metrics that they did 15, 20 years ago in student ministry. So it's about how many go to the event. It's about how many show up on a regular basis. So a lot of student pastors are really wrestling with that to a lot of families, the church is not necessarily the central aspect of their faith anymore. And so how can we as ministries continue to reach them and partner with them? And sometimes there's a disconnect of what might be the most successful and effective thing for a student ministry to do, and what leadership is expecting that student pastor to do in his or her group as they're trying to lead. So that's just one of the challenges of are student leaders even given the opportunity to lead in a way that they feel like is most successful and effective?
That's
Yeah. Go ahead, Crystal.
Well, there's also there's this piece of research.
Yes, that's great.
Actually, I mean, this is extraordinary work. If you're watching and you haven't checked out the state of religion in young people, just know that on our end, it's provided incredible clarity, but also incredible talking points with leaders and volunteers. And one of those is that of affiliated young people, people who would say, I am in with a church or a synagogue or a religious organization, 33% attend services less than once a year. So for us, especially for people like me as a church volunteer, to say that I am only serving in a program means I am immediately disqualifying a third of kids who already say they're in. And if we're able to begin to take those volunteers and those leaders and say, hey, we want you to be a pastor, even if that kid never shows up again.
Yeah.
You to create community, even if their family doesn't come to our church anymore. I think we might stand a chance of reaching and mentoring those 33% of kids who won't show up this year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it does, like, when we sort of spin that out into like what do you do with that? I've been giving talks. I get a lot of talks because it's all virtual, right? So I don't have to leave my house. So I can give a lot more Zoom presentations than ever.
You got shorts on right now, don't you?
No, full pants every time. I'm committed to the adult work. But I've been telling people, like, where do you start with this? And one of the things I've been saying is, you should have a list written down or on your computer of every kid in your congregation, every young person in your congregation. And a lot of them will be like, great, I got that. I was like, but hold on. You should have a list of every young person in your congregation and their two best friends. And invariably that's where it breaks down. Like that, to all of a sudden it goes from being like, okay, I can do that, or we have done that, to like, how would I even begin? I'm like, so you have a list of them, but you don't talk to them, right? Like that's the reason why you don't know who their two best friends are. And I think it's just it just points out that I think the limits of that institutional program only solution, that those things are not. Crystal, do you want a little sneak peek into State of Religion and Young People 2021?
Yes, please. I'm obsessed. I'm memorizing stats over here.
Well, so we're just in the process of writing it now. So I'm not going to give a firm number because we want to do the final fact check, but it's over half of young people who are experiencing connection to the divine, God in some way, through nature on a weekly basis or more.
Wow.
But less than a third or whatever of, that stat, I can't remember what the stat is from this year, but it's something like that, who are going to something like 50-some percent, 52%, or who are going to church like once a year or less. And so, like, the locus, to use a fancy word, like the way we do religion is even changing to move outside of these institutional sort of walls. Well, as you all think about resourcing that, I mean, how do you, like, who you're resourcing, like they're largely in these institutions. I mean, but how do you all, like, begin to get people to recognize that, look, they're doing religious things, just not in these four walls?
I mean, on our end, we have this conversation a lot about how do we help teenagers discover what is sacred in what is natural, what is secular, what's all around them. How do we help them see God everywhere? Because, I mean, this Galatians tells us that the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and the list goes on. Well, if those are the fruits of the Spirit, those are also evidence of the Spirit.
Yeah.
So where did I see joy today? Where did I see peace today? Where did I see goodness today? And is it possible that those are evidence of a God I'm not sure about as a teenager? This is also incredibly helpful. Just honestly, I hope that our team is watching, because we are working on a talk that makes us all really nervous. And it's caring for creation. And we recognize that that can be a tricky conversation in churches because it's a politicized topic. But Gen Z cares deeply about it. And we can either let it only be a political topic, or we can teach students that creation points to a creator. That's why we care about it, and help them begin to connect the dots between, I care so much because I was wired to love Eden. Like, I care so much because I can see God and what God has made. Scripture is so clear about that. And so that stat, I hope you publish it very soon, because it's very helpful.
Well,
Go ahead, Brett.
Well, and I think that a big part of it is almost just permission and recognition, is that students for so long have almost been conditioned to believe that their faith is, I don't know if I would say bound to the physical church, but there is sort of this unspoken expectation that that's the way that it often gets lived out for them, is that I go to church to talk about God, or, you know, my whatever it is, and it doesn't necessarily permeate the rest of our life. And a lot of time they don't even recognize how it's supposed to. The language that we've been using a lot is this idea of everyday faith, is how do we help teenagers develop an everyday faith? And I think a big part of that is just helping them recognize pieces of that. Like, if you go on a 3-minute walk around your neighborhood, there are going to be things, if you get in the practice of that kind of solitude, or that kind of being in nature, there are things that you'll become aware of that otherwise you normally aren't, things that you'll start to think about that otherwise you normally don't think about. And I think that teenagers just need a little bit of help understanding, like, hey, that also is God. That also is your relationship with God. That also is inviting God and recognizing God at work in your life. And it's not just something that happens. I mean, we believe in what can happen in environments that the church does. We believe in what can happen in those things. I'm a pastor's kid. I grew up in those environments. I was a student pastor for 12 years before I started doing this. I believe in what can happen at a weekend retreat and a week at camp and a Wednesday night. But the reason we do what we do is we don't want it to just stay those things. We want to give them the ability and the skills and the awareness of how to take this and to make it an everyday faith for them.
Yeah, that's really great. Make it an everyday faith. I want to encourage people to, if you have questions, go ahead and feel free to drop them in the comments. Also, I don't want to wait to the end to do this, so I'll give a quick little plug to say we will be writing about that. We'll be writing about it for the State of Religion in Young People 2021. That'll be out in this fall from Springtide Research at springtideresearch.org. And where can they find the two of you on? I'm at Dr. Josh Packard on Twitter. This is our Springtide Social, but where can they find the two of you on the internet and on the social media?
I am at Crystal C. Chiang everywhere. Chiang is Chiang, so Crystal C. Chiang on all platforms.
Yeah, and I'm Brett Ryan Talley, BretRyanTalley, exactly what it is on here, everywhere.
Great. And the website?
Well, honestly, the best place to find Brett or I is orangestudents.com. That's where we have a ton of free resources. There's also a way to contact both of us there.
I'm going to come back to that and have you do it again. But one of the places where, especially Brett and I have conversed a little bit is over on Twitter. And the other day I wrote this thing that I did not expect to gain, any traction. It was just sort of like mostly like sometimes you write things on Twitter that are like notes for yourself. Like I just want to pin like how I was feeling at the moment. And I said, institutions are not effective containers for belief, religion, or spirituality anymore. My work must transcend boundaries, encouraging youth ministers and student ministers to sort of like repeat that until they like was embedded in their souls. And I think that's a lot of what you all are describing, but it gave several people, both in my DMs and even right on Twitter, like some pause, like that, just the notion of saying that was very challenging, that I have to transcend these boundaries. But I think we're seeing that with this generation, that of course you only have whatever 200 and some characters on Twitter. You can't get in, It's weird for a researcher like me who wants to qualify everything. But it's not just religion. Like work doesn't just stay at work anymore. We don't just get education, either at the end of through the end of high school or through the end of college. That continuing ed and constantly learning are big parts of all of our lives now for professionals in any way. And so all of these boundaries are being sort of like torn apart and blurred, and sometimes with what seems like maybe the relevance of particular things. Like I just finished about a 15-year career teaching in universities, and I felt like by the time it was done this past spring, like colleges just didn't have the same stature that they had when I started. It seems like churches are no longer the single container of faith. Synagogues are no longer the singular container, if they ever were even. Of Judaism, and in that case, like, do y'all have any thoughts about that? Do you see this generation sort of like flourishing in that environment, or are they sort of floundering and trying to figure out how to deal with the breakdown of all of these things? In some ways, I would think it's easier, like, oh, that's the place where I go to do school, and this place over here is where I go to do church. And now with the blurring of all those things, I can see it being really confusing.
Well, and that's where I think that the language of it's not an effective container is really challenging. And, you know, one of the pieces about, you know, being a ministry leader is it can feel really defensive to hear things like that, because it's like, wait, we've given our life to this. But there's so much truth there. And to me, when I was reading that, my train of thought went to, it is not an effective container. It was never designed to be a container. We turned it into a container. It was designed to be a catalyst. And so how can we allow these places to be catalysts where we come and we question and we wrestle, and we all know that, you know, Judaism has done a much better job historically of that side of faith than, you know, Protestant Christianity especially. But how do we create these environments in these spaces, yes, of faith, where we come together and we wrestle and we challenge and we learn and we ask and we doubt together, and then we challenge each other to take that into our lives, and what does that look like as we go from there? Sky Jethani, I don't know if you're familiar with Sky, but he has this great analogy where he talks about a cruise ship, the church turning into a cruise ship. Is that for a long time, you know, the church was I forget what he said, but basically a ship to transport. The church existed to help be a catalyst for us, to help us understand, to get from A to B, and then we kind of go about our lives and we allow it to permeate the rest of our lives. But at some point, the church turned into a cruise ship where there was no need to get off of the cruise ship, and that has always challenged the way that I thought about it. So all of that came back to me. When you're with your effective container, it's not an effective container. I don't think it was ever supposed to be a container. I think we've turned it into that. I think that getting back to this idea of how do we allow it to be a catalyst is where it's most effective.
So well said. Not a container, but a catalyst. I love that. It's a nice. So, you know, sometimes when as researchers, like when we're looking at the data and we just want to say like what we see, but it's not always like posited in a very hopeful way. And I love that twist on it. Like it wasn't designed to do that.
Yeah.
But the one like sort of thing I would sort of underscore there, or maybe push back on, is like like in the world from like maybe 1960 to 90 or so, I think it worked pretty well for that purpose for, you know, a particular group of people, like largely like mainstream white, you know, Christian. Like the institution was actually a pretty good job at sort of doing both of those things. But in this new reality where like Gen Z is the largest and most diverse generation that's ever existed, and institutional trust has eroded across all the different places that we can possibly imagine, like those things stop to be, you know, one-to-one correlations. That's a really good point. Hey, so I want to get you. We try to keep these things right at half an hour. I want to respect your time. So I want to get you out of here with a question about to sort of. You've likely not heard of this term, so I'm going to spring it right on the spot. It's a new phrase, but it's new relatively. Anyway, whatever. We've been trying to think about, like, the feeling that we get about Gen Z is that they are not necessarily deconstructing any more than teenagers are always deconstructing, right? But unlike their sort of millennial counterparts, where that defined maybe, like, that was the distinctive thing about the generation. One of our advisory board members, Casper ter Kuile, has encouraged us to think about Gen Z as sort of faith unbundled, that it's not this sort of like wrapped together bunch of sticks, but that it's sort of a bunch of stuff laying around and they're sort of picking up pieces here and there. But I'm wondering sort of how you would respond to that metaphor, this idea that faith is coming in bits and pieces and sort of trying to make sense of the fragments and put them together in some ways for these, you know, 13, 15, 17-year-olds.
You know, it's funny. I think sometimes teenagers are wiser than we give them credit for being, and particularly Gen Z, I think, is just leading the way in calling for authenticity, calling for a faith that's real, a faith that matches in action what it says in words. And so when I hear unbundled, maybe it's my own evangelical baggage talking here, but there's a part of me that thinks that sounds like teenagers just want to pick and choose the pieces of faith that they like best or that are most comfortable. And I'm not sure that that's it.
Mm.
They're just looking for the pieces of faith and the places of faith that are the most authentic and that seem the most real to them, that are the most believable to them. And from the teenagers that I've led and the youth workers that I talk to, it seems true across the board. The teenagers are willing to do really hard things and to step into really difficult places if they trust that those hard things and difficult places are true and real and worth it.
Yeah.
And as leaders, I think our bundling sometimes was in order to make things easy. And the unbundling is a way of teenagers being a little bit wiser and going, well, do these two things always go together? Do I have X if I believe Y? And is it possible that Y is not as true and that X is very true? And so I have really come to admire Gen Z in that respect. Brett, what would you say?
Yeah, I'm very curious.
Yeah, I think that there's the idea of deconstruction in Gen Z. I'm an introvert and I'm having a hard time exactly finding the language that I like, and so my brain's not allowing me to talk very clearly. I feel like millennials and Gen X, that the idea of deconstruction kind of became not popular, but it became that language became mainstream. And I think that as Gen Xers and millennials have been leading student ministries for a while for Gen Z, I think that what we're seeing with Gen Z is they're being invited into the space to almost build and deconstruct their faith at the same time. And I think that, you know, we talk about the idea of how do we create safe spaces, and that's a big thing for us about why, you know, adults really matter and what their roles are. Pastors and shepherds lead small group, that kind of language that you might hear a lot from Orange. I think that we're trying to create those spaces so that, I mean, I've heard parents talk about, I want my students to begin to develop a faith and an understanding of God that doesn't lead them to therapy later in life like it led me. And so I think that there's something that's happening in Gen Z and in student ministry right now where there is such an encouragement and a push to create these safe spaces for them to be able to doubt out loud, to be able to, like we're saying, I think it's less about, like Crystal's saying, kind of picking and choosing what we believe all from, you know, different aspects. And I think it's just a little bit of, I mean, what we see in teenagers a lot where, you know, they spend 3 months as one person to see what it's like. And then they spend 3 months and they adjust some things about who they are to see what that is like. And I think that there's just a little bit of construction and reconstruction happening in Gen Z where they're picking up some pieces over here and then they're deciding, oh, does this really fit in my bundle? I don't know that this does. They set that down and they pick up some other pieces. And that outside of a catalyst, outside of some caring adults who are not telling them which bundles to pick up, but helping them process, why are they picking up the things that they're picking up? What kind of fruit, going back to what Crystal said, what kind of fruit does what you have picked up, what kind of fruit does that have in your life? And having some guides along the process for them, I think is really healthy. And I think that sadly what we're seeing in a lot of Gen Z is they're trying to put their bundles together and trying to figure out what all of this looks like. And they don't have those guides. They don't have those people to really be able to help them process what they're picking up, why they're picking up, and the effect that it might be having on their life.
Yeah, that's so well put. And we don't, you know, I think you're entirely right, both of you, that we see no evidence in the data. We get no indication from the young people who are our advisory board, or you know, who we interview for our podcast or anything, that the idea of having like these pieces of faith or fragments that they're turning to try and assemble is a way of getting out of things. I think you're right, Crystal. Like, they'll do hard things when it's worth it. And when, like, we clearly made and articulated through our, you know, through demonstration what the value proposition is, instead of just telling them this is why you should do this, but like really living that out and being the evidence of that, like, you know, our position at Springtide is that in order for a young person to flourish, their faith life has to be flourishing. And that doesn't always mean that they have to have a commitment, but that has to be considered. Like, the worst thing that can happen is that they just don't ever think about it. And it's you know, I've been also similarly like really encouraged in ways that I never felt like I had the freedom to do when I was, you know, 15 or 16 years old, to be able to watch young people say like, hey, like how much of this of like your tradition can I get
Yeah.
without having to also take like your racist past or
Yep.
like I really care about the environment. You don't seem to. Is there like still some engagement that we can have here? As opposed to like what I felt like I was often confronted. I mean, very, you know, normal suburban, I mean, not normal, but I mean like dominant mainstream ideological suburban Lutheran growing up, which is like, here's the thing, you can either have this whole thing or you can have none of that thing. And so to watch Gen Z sort of, I think, pick the values that they care about and then fight for those things is, through the lens of faith has been, I don't know, just really promising for me.
Yeah.
I want to thank you both for being here. Let's one more time, we'll go around and do the sort of like, where can we find you stuff? So we'll get started. Go ahead and give us your social handles and websites again.
I love it. Josh, first, thanks so much for having us. This has
Absolutely.
We are such fans of Springtide and so grateful for your work. I am at Crystal C. Chang on every platform, crystalcchang.com, and also orangestudents.com.
Yep, orangestudents.com, and then Brett Ryan Talley, exactly as you see it here, brettryanTalley.com, on Twitter. Those are mainly the two places that I live the most, is Instagram and Twitter. Yeah,
and you can come, especially over on Twitter, you can come over and chat with me and Brett occasionally. So every once in a while we have something that piques the interest of the other. I'm at Dr. Josh Packard on Twitter. We Are Springtide is the Springtide account across all platforms. You can find us on the web at springtideresearch.org. We do have an upcoming State of Religion and Young People 2021 report, which is all focused on helping young people navigate uncertainty, especially as we look to do so from often institutional positions, but knowing that we have to reach outside of those institutions to help young people make sense out of what just happened to them over the last year and a half. So we do hope that you check that out. Thanks to a very generous donation that will be free again this year in digital form and low cost print on Amazon. But that'll be out later this fall. So thank you both so much. We'll have this up on IG Live. We'll put it up on YouTube as well so people can keep checking it out.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah,
thanks everybody.